Well, hey, y'all, it's Matt Steen, co-founder of Chemistry Staffing. Really excited to have a conversation today with Mike Bonem. So, Mike, if you don't know Mike, you need to. He's written the Leading from the Second Chair, and he's got a brand new book out called The Art of Leading Change. So, which everybody needs to go and buy at least 3 of these. But Mike also has just has created or crafted a career of coming alongside church leaders, coaching, consulting, and just really has a heart and a love for the local church. And so I greatly appreciate his heart and really always cherish the times that I get to talk with him. So Mike, thanks for taking some time to talk with us.
Well, thanks for your kind words, Matt. Yeah, it's really good to be with you again.
Cool. So the new book, okay, it's called The Art of Leading Change, 10 Perspectives on the Messiness of Ministry. I can't imagine why you felt a need to write this.
You've never seen a messy ministry, huh?
Oh, never.
Right? Yeah.
Especially not the last couple of years. So
right. Well, and it was needed before that, but certainly more so today. It seems like because things have only gotten messier. And I had the very first book that I co-authored with a couple of other friends was titled Leading Congregational Change. And I often, when I would talk about that book or have an opportunity to speak at a conference, would say, most of what I'm going to talk about today is the science of leading change. It's the process. It's kind of, follow these steps. And I would always, offer the caveat, but there's also an art to leading change. Yes. It's the stuff, and frankly, I would say it's the stuff that's harder to teach.
Yes.
It's the messiness that involves people and all the uncertainties as we're leading change. And so I got tired of just saying that and decided at least try to put into words some of what I've seen and experienced around that art of leading change, around that messiness that always involves people.
Yeah. What I like about the way that you organize is around 10 axioms is the word you use, but just statements that really kind of hit home and really kind of hit the heart of what you're trying to drive home here. And I think that the art piece of that really lines up with that. What I really loved, Mike, and what I'm grateful is in there and really got hung up on, had to read it a couple of times, was your 6th axiom, the 6th chapter on this. And it's I want to make sure that I'm reading this right. So it's resistors are not the enemy.
Yeah.
So tell us why did you find the need to go there?
Well, right. Sort of like, why did I need to talk about messiness? Right. It happens everywhere.
Exactly.
So, let's back up a step and acknowledge that no matter how well designed a change process is, no matter how compelling the vision is, no matter how much you're convinced that it is absolutely God ordained and you're moving exactly where God wants your ministry or your church to go, there's going to be resistance. I'm sure a lot of your listeners have also read Todd Bolsinger's book, Canoeing the Mountains, and he talks about sabotage, right? And that sabotage is just to be expected. And so it's not a question of design a better process, come up with a more compelling vision. It's just, I know I'm going to run into some resistance, and then how do I deal with that? How do I react to that? And to ever increasing degrees, I think in our society, we're becoming more and more polarized. And
Yes.
With polarization comes this tendency to say, look, you're either with me or you're against me. There's no middle ground. And if you're against me, you're the enemy.
Yeah.
And, I don't think it's playing particularly well in national politics, but I'm not going to get into a political discussion. But I will certainly say in your church, it does not work well.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, that was the reason for writing it is to say, let's, instead of immediately treating them as the enemy, let's explore other ways that we can think about that person who may be resisting.
That's really strong, because I think back to the Mars Hill podcast, right? And by now everybody, their brothers, listen to this. And so much of the message there was, you're either with me or you're against me. And there was never that room for middle ground. There was never that room for reconciliation almost. And we see how well, I mean, you look at how it works on the national spotlight in politics, but even more, we hear these stories of churches that have that mindset, and that never ends well either. And so
Right.
we don't talk a whole awful lot in seminaries about, how do we, one, what are resistors and genuine resistors, and two, how do we deal with those? And so as you coach pastors, what are you telling them as they come up against this resistance? How do they deal with it?
Well, first is to recognize that it's normal, and that it should not be unexpected. I was just with a group of pastors actually earlier today, and I said, so I'm not sure that I want to say that you shouldn't be surprised, because you never know where the resistance is going to come from. And so in some sense, it is surprising. It comes from a person you don't expect it to come from, or you think you've gotten far enough down the road, and then you're surprised and then all of a sudden it pops up. And so it's often surprising, because you didn't exactly know that it was coming, but you should know in one way or another it's going to happen. So the first coaching point is just say, look, it will happen. Don't be shocked. And I think the second coaching point is to really, rather than immediately kind of pushing them off to the side as the enemy, start to explore, where's the resistance coming from? And even what might my part in having created that resistance be, which is a really hard word, but I mean, at the end of the day, we can't control other people. We can only control ourselves. And so, starting to ask the question, what role might I have played? And how can I approach them in a way to understand the source of their resistance?
That's great. So recognize that we may need to own some of this, which you just made fans of everybody listening to this now. So good job on that. But
I've got to dig myself out of the hole now.
Exactly. But then, go and give them a listen. So much of what is I'm talking to leaders that I'm connecting with, it's, a lot of times the question I have is, so how many cups of coffee have you had with this person? Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or are you responding by email? And so much of ministry needs to be fueled by those coffee conversations to understand what's going on in somebody's life, and to understand why, you might have stepped on some toes. As you've been coaching, I mean, are you seeing a resistance to having the face-to-face conversations and to really kind of go in there and potentially own? What do you think drives that?
Well, again, I think we've been more and more conditioned socially that, you deal with it in, text and email and social media.
Yeah.
There's also, this is particularly true among pastors, resistance. I mean, we just don't like conflict for the most part. I know there's some that engage in it, but, that pastoral mindset, right? I want to love everybody, and I want everybody to love me. And so where does conflict fit in with that? So that's another reason that having the face-to-face, and people are stretched awfully thin.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this seductive lure to think, well, I can answer it in one email and then I'm done with it. And gosh, that takes 5 minutes. The coffee, it's going to take an hour out of my day. It's not going to be pleasant. And so I think all of those reasons cause people to be reluctant to engage in that coffee conversation. And the reality is that the coffee, like you said, the conversation over the cup of coffee, it may not be pleasant, but it is much more likely to produce a fruitful outcome than any of the other means that you have available.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, I'm so grateful that you're leaning in on this piece in particular, because it just seems like, especially with some of our younger pastors, and that just probably got me in trouble, but there is that almost innate reaction of, I guess fight or flight, and we can lean in and go to the mattresses from day one, or we can actually take the time to hear what somebody's saying and potentially reconcile. And they may never agree with you, right? But they won't, be vocally going after you.
And they still may vocally go after you. I mean, right? I mean, that's also a reality. But until you at least lean into it more, you don't know. And maybe it was just a miscommunication, right? They just simply misunderstood something.
Yeah.
And you get cleared up. Maybe they actually have identified a problem with whatever it is that you're proposing that you haven't thought of. And that's why they're resisting, right? You know, well, turns out my idea was half-baked after all. And they just saved me a ton of pain and wasted energy and I found that out by having the conversation with them. Maybe they feel like, you know, we cut them out of the process.
Yeah.
You know, they were not at the table when the decision was made. And so there's some hurt feelings maybe about that, but I can talk to them, and I can't undo the fact that they weren't at the table, but the conversation may make them feel like they're included enough now that they get behind it. I mean, there are a number of other possibilities besides just the one that says, I had the conversation, I can check it off my list. They're still resistant, but they're a little bit less resistant now than they were before.
Absolutely. That's great. And so I know this is an unfair question, totally unrelated to what we've been talking about. You know, I know all 10 of your axioms are like your children and you love them all equally, but do you have a favorite?
Exactly. but
do you have a favorite? I won't tell the others.
Yeah, right. I mean, I really do care. The one around resistance is one that, you know, I knew as soon as I started noodling on the idea for the book, I knew I had to write that one.
Yeah.
I think another one that I'm partial to is the very first one, which is entitled "Lead with Trust." And I'm partial of that one because I think trust gets misunderstood a lot of times in ministry.
Yeah.
The posture that pastors can easily take is, I'm your pastor. Of course you should trust me, or you have to trust me. I mean, you know, I'm a man of God. I actually believe the 10 Commandments, and I don't lie, and I don't steal, and so there can be an expectation of imputed trust. And there's a couple of problems with that. One is that a lot of people have been burned by people in ministry. And so they don't automatically trust. And so, you know, regardless of how wonderful and impeccable your credentials are, you still need to earn their trust.
Yes.
Another problem with it, I think, is that there's a lot of different levels of trust. And, you know, I use a story in the book just to get it out of the ministry context. You know, there's a lot of people that I would trust to go and to bring my change back if I gave them a $20 bill, and not that anybody carries cash anymore, but if I gave them a $20 bill and asked them to, you know, go get me a Starbucks and bring me the change back, right? Yeah. Any number of people. When our kids were younger and we wanted to go out on a date and, you know, we wanted a babysitter, there were precious few people that I would trust to watch my kids.
Yeah.
And the same is true with the church. Pastor, do I trust you not to lie? Oh yeah, I trust you not to lie. Do I trust you in some of these bigger leadership decisions? Show me you've really earned it.
Yeah. How long do you believe it takes for us to really be trusted by a congregation?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, and that's, you know, what is the congregation's history? Right? If the last pastor or the pastor before that, or even the pastor before that, is someone who in their eyes was untrustworthy, and I'm emphasizing their eyes, right?
Yeah.
Then it's going to take a lot longer to build trust than if they've had stellar history of one pastor after another. And you got to remember that even it's not just that church's history, it's all the individuals in the churches and their history with the church and with previous pastor. But, you know, a minimum of 6 to 12 months and likely longer than that. I was just with somebody today. two stories just from this week. One associate pastor who said, "Oh, the previous pastor and the previous pastor left 7 years ago. We still don't speak that person's name in the church."
Wow. That's an impact on the net, man. Oof.
Yeah.
That's a
And
cloud
so
over the next guy.
and we were specifically talking about doing some sort of planning work, strategic discernment work in the church. And he said, I think that's maybe why my lead pastor is still reluctant to do that, because the previous senior pastor engaged in some sort of planning, brought in consultants, and either then used it as a weapon or just nothing happened with it.
Right.
And either way, people felt very, either disappointed, betrayed, burned, right?
Yeah.
And then, I was talking with another pastor this week, in this case, a senior pastor, who said, I tried to engage in a sort of a strategic planning process in my first year. And I'm realizing now that the reason that it didn't go well is that I had not been there long enough to have earned their trust. So, yeah, it takes time, and they're watching every move you make. And so, owning up to when you make a mistake and being honest and humble about that actually earns trust. But certainly not, getting ahead too far ahead and getting out over your skis, to use another analogy, right? Because then you're going to go tumbling down.
Yeah. So much of the onus is on us as pastors to exegete our congregation just as much as we're doing the scriptures and understanding, when is it too soon to do, but we get so excited.
And that's one of the things that I talk about in that chapter in the book is, rather than assuming that we're trusted or assuming that we put up enough wins on the scoreboard that they just by definition must trust us now, we actually really need to be listening, and not just listening ourselves, but empowering other people to listen for us and bring us back some feedback. I mean, what I would want more than anything else, if I were still in a local church environment, would be a handful of people who really have their finger on the pulse of the congregation and who would be honest with me, and who would tell me, hey, Mike, you know what? You thought that went really well, and the way you said it really stepped on some toes, and you've got some repair work to be done if you want this particular group or this particular person to trust you.
And that's one of those things that's so tough for us sometimes to really kind of embrace, right? Because, that's the political nature of church, and instantly we all think that politics is bad in church, but it's also human nature, isn't it? We need to navigate that and make sure that we're speaking to the needs and of what our congregation, is bringing into this.
Yeah, because I'll go back to the other axiom we talked about resistors are not the enemy. That person that was somewhat offended by something you did yesterday that you didn't know about or didn't make amends for, maybe because you weren't even listening and didn't know about it, right?
Yeah.
Is the future potential resistor.
Yeah.
Right. And on the flip side, if you are able to go back and say, hey, I know I blew it on this one, and that may be to an individual or maybe to the whole congregation. I pushed really hard for us to undertake this new idea, and you know what? Number one, I pushed too hard and didn't get enough input, and number two, it was a bad idea. I'm sorry. That gives you more of an opportunity then on the next one to not have that resistance build up as much.
Absolutely. That's great. And so much of this, we inherently know that so much of ministry is relationship, but it's so easy for us to forget that, it's relationship, right? And so much of it is keeping short accounts with our relationships and not giving into the temptation of efficiency, doing the text message, doing this, the email, and instead of doing, the actual relational work of going and sitting down and having those deep conversations, hard conversations.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if I were going to pick out, you asked me to pick a favorite. I'm going to go to one more, Matt, unless you had a different direction you wanted to go.
No, go for it.
Because I'm worried about one of my 10 chapter children being, very upset with me. So I think it's number 9. It's one of the latter ones. Is who is not in the room, and the idea there is that when we pull a leadership team together, and this could be just the staff of a large church, but more often it's it includes the volunteer leaders, the board, the elders, the deacon body, the session, whatever terminology fits for a particular church. It's a bunch of insiders.
Yeah.
And and then we're tasked with making decisions. And I don't remember now who said it, but the church is the only organization that exists for people who are not a part of it.
Right.
And yet that often does not enter our decision calculus, or it doesn't enter it very well, very fully.
Yeah.
And so the part of the art of leading change, to go back to the whole concept of the book, is figuring out ways that we can continually be reminded of who's not in the room as we're making decisions. Whether it's the person that we feel called to reach, or the person who's already a part of the church but is on the fringes.
Yeah.
But there's if we lose sight of that, then we lose a lot of the momentum for the changes that God is likely calling us to make.
Yeah.
And so just being cognizant of that is incredibly important.
So what's if you're talking to a pastor that's trying to be cognizant of who's not in the room, what are some simple, or it may not be simple, but I mean, what are some ways that they can be incorporating that into the culture of their leadership?
Helping the leaders to engage in it, to either remember and think about interactions they've had with people like that, or actually bringing people into the room, at least briefly, right?
Yeah.
So it's think about, do we have a teacher or a principal in our church who they're interacting all the time with the people in the community? Should they be on our leadership board, right? Because they have a perspective that, that the retired person who their entire circle of friends or church members may not have.
Right.
Right. Or do we have somebody who's relatively new to the church and who we feel like has the spiritual maturity to be on the board? Let's get them to talk about what it was like to be a newcomer to the church.
Yeah.
Or that retired person whose entire circle of friends is church members, but they have an adult child who wandered away from the church when they graduated from high school and hadn't been back. Have we heard their story and heard their pain and started to process that through the lens of gosh, what would it take for us to reach, if not that actual child, at least some other child of a person who's out of church, right?
Yeah.
That's the book is filled with fictionalized stories of real churches. And the story that I tell in that particular chapter, that's one of the examples that I give, is a person on the leadership team of the church saying, hey, a church talking about, we're going to start a new worship service so that we can better reach the young people in the community. And the board member saying, my child wouldn't come to what we're talking about.
Oh.
My young adult child would not come to that, because you're talking about having the worship service at just a different time on a Sunday morning, and everybody who's here is all buttoned up in their suits and ties. And, my child's going to feel pretty out of place coming here in their shorts and t-shirt with all their tats showing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And so just anything like that, just to create more awareness of, and so, yeah, it can be done. It can definitely be done.
It can be done. And it has to be going into it open-handed, actually listening and not trying to, correct.
Right.
We'll tell them where they're wrong,
right.
about their experience, that kind of
right.
thing. Yeah.
I remember a couple of years ago, one church that was talking about, we want to be more effective in connecting with young adults. And they were going down the path of starting a new worship service. I mean, that's right. That's one of our default answers.
Right.
And before they got too far, they said, well, let's pull a group of young adults together, and actually a few that are in our church, and just ask them what they think they and their friends would be interested in. Wow, what a novel idea, right?
Yeah.
And I said, we don't want a worship service. We actually kind of like what the church is offering right now, but would be really interested and would be likely to invite our friends just to a home gathering. Oh, okay. So before we run out and spend all that money to launch a new worship service, right?
Yeah.
Let's start with the home gathering and see where that goes.
Yeah.
And it had some real traction for them. So,
that's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. And that's again, we go back to the relational issue. Right? There's nothing new under the sun, right?
Yeah.
So Mike, thank you so much for this. Thanks for the book. Let me ask you one other question before we wrap up. I mean, you're talking with churches all over the country. You're seeing what's going on around us. What encouragement are you giving pastors these days as you look to the future? What are you saying? Hey, let's be thinking about this and start thinking about heading in that direction. Or what are you encouraging churches to do these days?
Well, Matt, I'm a big believer in naming the reality. And the reality right now is that there is a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty produces stress and anxiety. And with all that we've been through, there's a lot of anxiety and fatigue. And so I think part of what I often tell people is let's at least name it. Yeah. And then let's ask the question of, are we still trying to hang on to too much of the old stuff? And that's part of what's creating the fatigue that we're feeling.
Yeah.
But people still need Jesus. There's still a spiritual hunger.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, I think we may need to still lose a lot of the old wineskins, but that doesn't mean that we give up on the wine, right? We need to find those new ones because there's still a real hunger out there. And so that's really, I think, one of the refrains in the conversations that I have.
Yeah, that's great. So, Mike, thanks so much for the time.
Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah. So the name of the book is The Art of Leading Change, 10 Perspectives on the Messiness of Ministry. I'll link down to it so everybody can go buy a box after you've watched this. But
buy one for yourself and one for that resistor, right?
Exactly.
And then sit down over coffee and talk about it together.
That's exactly it. You'll throw in a Starbucks gift card for every 2 copies purchased, right? Or something like that. So.
Something like that. Yeah. Awesome. Great. Enjoyed it, Matt.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.